All right, 1 Corinthians chapter 11 is kind of fascinating. I'll be honest, I spent a lot of time just working on the introduction for this class. In chapter 8, 9, and 10, what was the main subject that we talked about? Exactly. The question of whether you can eat that meat that had been offered idol. Can you go to the temple for their feast that they have, in celebration of their gods, their idols? And Paul had a very nuanced answer to that. We saw that there's very many different levels of, it's not just a simple yes or no. There was much involved in that. Moving forward in chapter 11, what we're going to look at next week, starting in verse 17, is the Lord's Supper. And there's a pretty obvious connection to looking at the feast days that the Corinthians celebrated and whether they could participate, whether they could eat the meat that was sacrificed there. And Paul talking about the Lord's Supper and what that should mean to the Corinthians. That's their spiritual feast. It's not like the feast that the Corinthians did, which would be closest to our Thanksgiving, to be honest with you. But the Lord's Supper is something very different than that. But yet you can see the connection that Paul was going to make. The problem is what's in between. What we're going to be looking at today doesn't just jump out and say, oh, I can see how this connects to that, or I can see how this connects to that. Because what we're going to be looking at this evening is dealing with whether a man or a woman should wear a covering while they're praying or prophesying, and whether men should wear long hair or women should shave their heads. I don't see a real obvious connection to just jump out and say, oh, I see how that relates to the feast days, or I can see how that relates to the Lord's Supper. Now, I know some commentators have kind of just taken the view, well, Paul is known for his digressions, and this is just one of his digressions. That's really not fair. It's not fair to Paul, and it's really not understanding that when Paul takes what they're calling a digression, he's taking one aspect of what he's been talking about, and he focuses on that. And I think that's what he's doing here also, but at least for me, it was not just blazingly obvious. I spent a lot of time trying to really wrap my head around this and figure out, how does Paul get from whether you can eat meat offered at the temple of Aphrodite to whether a man should wear long hair or not, or whether a woman should shave her head? How do you get from here to there? Well, let's kind of look at it first before I try to suggest to you what I think the connection is. And then certainly I want to get everybody else's view to see kind of what you see, whether it makes sense or not. Let me start in verse 1. I really should have talked about this last week. It's a very important verse, but it really goes with what we talked about last week. In verse 1, Paul makes the statement, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. I think very much he is talking about the attitude that he had shown, using himself as an example, particularly in chapter 9, but really as it applied in all of these questions. Can we do this? Should we do that? And Paul's root answer is, what's going to help others? What's going to be edifying and beneficial to others? And he demonstrated by his own life, the way that the example that he set before them. And I think that's what he's coming back to here. He said, be an imitator of me as I am of Jesus Christ. So essentially he's saying, if you see my example being that of Christ, then learn from that. Let that be an example for you. But then as we get into chapter 11, he starts with praise. And we talked about this in one of the previous classes. That's a good way to start when you're talking to somebody. Just make sure it's not flattery. What's the difference between praise and flattery?
One's to be earnest and the other is usually getting to give something.
Yeah, I like that. Praise is something where you're saying something that you see good about somebody to build them up. Where flattery is something where maybe you just made up something, or even if it is something that's there, that's real, you're doing it to benefit yourself. It kind of goes back to that knowledge and love that we talked about back in chapter 8. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. So Paul starts by praising them. And what does he praise them for? There's a particular thing here, and I think this is going to help us to start understanding what he's talking about. What is it that they're doing or not doing? In this case, it is doing. What is it that they're doing that he is praising them for? Yeah, they're holding fast to the traditions that he had delivered to them. That's kind of interesting because in much of his previous answer, he talked about giving up your rights, giving up your liberties. But here they're holding on to something. They're holding fast to the traditions that he had delivered to them. And obviously this is a good thing. Paul is telling these traditions. I got to admit, every time I hear the word tradition, I start thinking of Fiddler on the Roof. And I hear Tevye singing that song, Tradition. But there are good traditions. Sometimes we tend to look at Matthew 15 and we say, oh, tradition's bad. There's times where traditions are bad and there's times when traditions are good. And this was a time when a tradition was good because it was delivered by an apostle and it was something that would help them in their service. But then he says in verse 3, but. So holding the traditions by themselves is not the end goal. Instead, what he does here in verse 3 is he's talking about, he makes three statements here that have to do with headship. And I believe this is the key word to understanding what we're going to study this evening. It's a Greek word, kephale. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly or not. Commentators have not come down with a definite answer as to the best English word to define it by. I've seen some that use the term head. Some will talk about preeminence. Some will talk about the idea of a source. And all of them in some context are appropriate translations. But I'm going to go ahead and use the New American Standard, headship. I think in this context, it is the best translation. So what are the three statements that Paul makes here when he talks about headship?
Verse 3, Christ is the head of every man, the man is the head of the woman, and God is the head of Christ.
Okay, and I've got those on the board, put in the order that you kind of take these all together and put them together in the order. Number one, when we talk about headship, does that talk about inherent value? No, not at all. Because you would have the position the Jehovah's Witnesses do to say is that God is supreme and Christ is a lesser being. And of course, obviously, you would have the real problem of saying that men are greater than women in some way. Yep, there are some men who have thought that. There's some women who have thought that, but that's not what this says at all. This is hierarchy. Just like if you are not the boss at your company, you have somebody who is the boss. Does that mean they're a more valuable person than you are? They may be more valuable in the role they do, but I'm saying, are they inherently a greater person just because they draw a bigger paycheck or they have a higher title than you do? But we all understand that. It doesn't mean it. It's hierarchy. Somebody has to make the decisions, and they're the ones who make that decision. It's interesting. Jesus actually had a discourse with a Roman centurion. And this Roman centurion wanted Jesus to heal his servant. And Jesus said, I'll come to your house. What did the man say? Anybody remember? I said, I'm not worthy if you'd come to my house. But he made the statement. He says, I know what it means to have people under me, and I know what it means to answer to somebody else. And when he said I'm not worthy for you to come to my house, he's not saying that I'm some worm or something like that. He's just simply recognizing Jesus is above me. He's recognizing this headship that Paul is talking to the Corinthians about. And it was interesting that was a Gentile. And Jesus praised that fact that this man, by his faith, understood this idea of headship. There's another interesting thing here. I'm not a Greek scholar by any stretch of the imagination. The only thing I know is what I've heard from other people. But one of the things that I have heard about Greek is the order of the words in the sentence are significant to understand what is the point of emphasis. The example that I've heard described to me is John 1:1. If you remember John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word was God, the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That last phrase, the Word was God, in Greek literally translated is God was the Word. Now in English, that doesn't mean the same thing. But in Greek, it's emphasizing the fact that the Word was God, where we would speak that strongly. That is the point of emphasis there. When we look at this here in verse 3, the beginning word in each one of those phrases is actually the one who is in submission. And the reason why I think that is significant is to understand that when Paul talks about this headship, he's not talking about the head as forcing the other to submit, but in fact, it's the other way around. That one is recognizing the other as being their head. And I think we see that in Jesus himself. When you look at Jesus in his earthly ministry, what did he continually emphasize about his relationship with the Father?
He did say what the Father wanted.
Exactly. He said, I don't speak on my own initiative. I don't do my will. I came to do the will of the one who sent me. Jesus voluntarily submitted himself to his head. But that same thing holds true with those other two statements. The first one is, Christ is the head of every man. In this context, the way that it's worded in Greek, what that really means is every man recognizes or submits himself to Christ as his head. That's the hierarchy that Paul is talking about here. It's not that Christ is going to force us to submit, but it's the fact that we voluntarily submit ourselves to Christ. And then as we saw, Christ voluntarily submitted himself to the Father, not my will, but your will be done. And so then as we look at this last statement, the man is the head of the woman, literally is the woman is recognizing a man, or literally her man as the head. Because there's a difference here. It says that Christ is the head of every man, or every man has Christ as his head. But then it says the woman has her husband or her man as the head. Now, why did I change from man to husband, woman to wife? In Greek, there is no difference. It's the same word. They didn't have different words for man and husband. It's the same word. And the same thing for woman and wife. It's the same word. Translators just always look in the context to try to determine which one is the appropriate English word to choose. Sometimes they get that right, sometimes they don't. I think in this context, husband and wife is a better translation than man and woman. Take that for what it's worth, but I think that's the context that Paul is talking about here. Specifically, the fact that he says every man, but then it's singular in talking about this relationship here. You might have any thoughts or questions up to this point? Mhm.
Other than any other interpretation would put the woman in a possible situation.
Yeah.
Subject to, I don't know my husband, but my neighbors and everybody else.
I fully agree with that. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think the context does demand it. Anybody else with any thoughts?
I think it's consistent with Ephesians 5,
Mhm.
talking about the order that's kind of outlined there in terms of men being subject to Christ, and then, women being in subjection to men.
Exactly. And that's a really good connection to make, because after Paul talks about that idea of the husband and the wife and their relationship with one another, one submitting to the other one loving the other one, he concludes by saying the mystery that I've been talking about is Christ and his church. This illustrates that. That's absolutely a great connection to make. All right, so Paul here has essentially laid a foundation. There's a foundation of hierarchy, and all of it relates to this idea of headship. And remember, we're talking about traditions. So then we come to verse 4. And verse 4 is where we start to actually get in the application as it applied to the Corinthians. Now, scholars tell us that historically, the Romans and the Greeks, one of the ways in which they differed in their cultures related to this very question. And I'll be honest, I can't remember which was which. Doesn't matter for our point. Let's just say in Greek culture that the men would have their heads covered while they worshiped, while in Roman it was uncovered. It may have been the reverse of it. I don't remember now which is which. But the point was, the Corinthians now in first century Corinth have already faced this kind of conflicting culture where what was a Greek city has now become a Roman colony. One culture said that you should cover your head. The other culture says you don't cover your head. And to me, that starts to help us to understand why Paul is talking about this in this particular context. We've been talking about them going to the temple worship. Can they go to the feast of Aphrodite? Can they eat this meat that has been offered in the marketplace? It was offered as a sacrifice. So it has to do with the culture in which they lived. And now Paul says, I praise you because you've been holding on to traditions that I taught you. Paul wasn't talking about the worship of Aphrodite. That's not the traditions he was teaching. He was teaching about Christ. In fact, he was teaching them about the Lord's Supper that we'll talk about next week. So that's the context in which he is now discussing this. And he says, the things that I have been talking about are based on this foundational truth. When ultimately did God put this hierarchy in place? Yeah, from Jesus, but I would even argue even before that. From the very beginning, I'd say from creation. Yeah, from creation, this hierarchy has been, I know that Christ wasn't named at that point, but absolutely, this has been God's design since the beginning. And I think Paul's going to make that argument as we get in here. He's going to argue this very point, that it's from the beginning that it has been this way, that God intended for it to be this way. But the culture around them, what does that do with God's design? The culture in which we live, what does it do with God's design? It perverts it, turns it upside down, mixes it all around, change it, do whatever you want, whatever makes you feel good. Cultures change. We know that cultures will flip this any way they want. You make your own God. Your God serves you. You flip it around, do whatever you want with it. Same thing is true in Corinth. They had a culture in which they lived that was changing, constantly changing God's natural design. We're going to get into that also this evening. And so Paul is taking them back to what it was at the beginning. So in looking at this particular question, he says, every man that has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head. Why is it a disgrace to his head if he covers his head while he's praying or prophesying? Well, if you drop down to verse 7, he answers that question. Why was it a disgrace for him to cover his head? Yeah, he's made in the image of God. In fact, he's called the glory of God. I don't know about you, but that kind of makes me a little bit uncomfortable. I want to think of God as being my glory. I don't want to think of me as being his glory. But when you look at creation, when we look at the story of creation, where's the emphasis? It's that sixth day. In the sixth day, God made man in his image. Even spoke about, let us make man in our image. So it's clear that man is in fact the focus of the creation of God. It is the glory of God. Not because of who we are, it's because of how God designed his creation. So even as we look at this hierarchy, we see that God is giving glory to what he has created. And so for man to cover himself while worshiping God, Paul says that's a shame, that's a disgrace to do that. But then he, in between, talks about in verse 5, every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head, for she is one and the same with she whose head is shaved. Okay, why make this distinction? Well, again, we drop down to verse 8 and verse 9. For man does not originate from woman, but woman from man. For indeed, man was not created for the woman's sake, but woman for the man's sake. Here, Paul takes us back to the very beginning. He takes us back to Genesis 2, verse 15, where it says, God saw that it was not good for man to be alone. And so he created for man a helper suitable for him. Now, again, does that mean the woman is somehow inferior to man? Not at all. It simply is a hierarchy. She was made for the man. And so that's why Paul is saying there is a distinction here in the way in which they are to worship. Now, we'll talk about in a minute what that physically means. But I just want to, first of all, just talk about the hierarchy itself and what this applies in this question of worship. Paul is saying the culture that tells the man to cover his head, that's a disgrace. Because the man is made in the glory of God. And the culture that says the woman to uncover her head, that's a disgrace. Because the woman was made for man. That's the hierarchy. All right, let's talk about now the physical aspect of that. And Adam, I know you come from Alabama. Generally in Alabama, this tends to be an issue that's discussed a lot more than in other parts of the country. And I'm not going to try to settle that debate this evening. I couldn't. There's been a lot smarter people than me that have been trying to do that for longer than I've been alive. But the fact is that there are some who feel like that women who are, from the time you begin the announcement to the time you say the closing prayer, and in the assembly, need to have something covering their head. And there are others who feel like that that's not what this is talking about at all. What's important to understand here is that whatever that physical manifestation is, what is the real meaning behind it? And what is the real meaning behind it, I think actually jumps forward. Let me get the verse number here. verse 10. Somebody could read verse 10.
That is why a wife ought to have a symbol over her head, because
Okay, your translation actually uses wife instead of woman. But your translation does the same thing the New American Standard says, a symbol of authority. Most of your translations will actually have that word symbol or symbol of in italics. What that means is the translators have added those words because they believe that it gives a better sense to the verse. And that may be true. I'm not going to argue with the translators. But literally translated, what this says is the wife or the woman has authority on her head. That word authority is something we've talked about in the last several classes. Back in chapter 8, remember we saw that word liberty? Be careful lest this liberty of yours become a burden or become a stumbling block to the weak. In chapter 9, Paul talked about his right to take a wife or his right to receive financial support from the church in Corinth. In chapter 10, go back and find the word here. All things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. That word liberty, the word right, the word lawful, and the word authority here in chapter 11. Anybody want to take a wild guess what I'm getting at? It's all the same word. It's all the same word. So Paul's been talking about kind of the same thing all along. We talked about this before. The word literally means the right to exist or the authority to exist. It comes from the root to be. And so Paul here is talking about, in chapter 8, he talks about liberty. What can you do? In chapter 9, he talks about my right, the things I'm allowed to do. In chapter 10, he talks about the things that are lawful, the things that the law allows me to do. And now he talks about a woman having authority on her head. And what he's really talking about in all of this is understanding headship. So even as she's worshiping, Paul is saying she needs to understand this hierarchy. That's the point that he's getting at here. And he's really emphasizing, don't let culture redefine what God said at the very beginning. So as we worship God, and let's not forget what Paul says in the book of Galatians. In Christ, there is no man or woman, there is no Jew or Greek, there is no slave or free. We're all equal in service to God. We all have equal value. Christ loves us all equally. But there is also hierarchy. And that doesn't change. It's timeless. It's from the beginning. And that's what Paul, I think, is emphasizing to the Corinthians is don't let culture that tries to upend all of that, change it all around. Don't let that creep into your worship. Instead, understand the hierarchy that God has set forth from the very beginning. Anybody with thoughts or questions up to this point? I know we've still got other things to look at, but is that making sense, what we've talked about so far? Boy, that comes fast. Let's look at verse 16. I sometimes actually start with the last verse, and I almost did that for the class this evening. What does he say in the last verse? The last verse of this section, verse 16.
Says if anyone wants to argue about this, we have no other custom nor do the churches of God.
I like that translation. Mine says contentious, but this really gets the point. If anybody wants to argue with this, what's fascinating here is I don't think Paul is emphasizing, and it's possible that this will be talking about contention or arguing between men and women, but I don't think that's the primary point. I really look at it more as arguing against God. And Paul's essentially saying, if you don't like this hierarchy of God, if you want to argue against that, he says, we don't have any other practice. There's nothing else we can talk about. I also found it fascinating. We often will talk about church autonomy, and I believe that's a very important subject for us to continually understand. I've seen too many times where people were thinking, well, what are the other churches going to think about us if we do that? And for the most part, it's I don't care what they're thinking. I think only what God cares. But this is one example where Paul actually does use that argument. He says, we don't have any other practice, and neither do any of the churches of God has any other practice. To the best of my knowledge, off the top of my head, this is really the only time I can think of where this idea appeal to what other churches are doing is ever used in Scripture. But essentially, Paul is saying this hierarchy is universal. It applies for all of us. One more thing I wanted to look at. In verse 10, the last part of verse 10, have that symbol of authority or have that authority on our head. Because of whom? Yeah, because of the angels. Wait a minute, why are the angels being brought up? Why are we talking about them? And maybe keeping it in the context we've been talking about, we actually see that back in chapter 6. Remember in chapter 6, they had a problem, the fact that some of the Corinthians were actually going to the law courts against each other. And Paul talked about how shameful that was. And he asked the question, don't you have anybody wise among you that can act as a judge in this? And he says, you should have people that are qualified to be judges because in verse 3, what does he say? We will judge angels. So this is not a subject that Paul is bringing up for the first time at this point. This is something he's already talked about. Now, I don't want to try to get too deep into that. We don't have time, and it really kind of gets us away from the subject. But there's a point to be understood here, the fact that the angels are watching. They're watching us. Why are they watching us? It's their job. That's the responsibility God has given them. We find in the book of Daniel is probably the clearest example of that there are angels appointed to watch us.
Particularly since you bring up angels watching us, it seems like they would be doing that all the time. But I mean, just thinking out loud, it occurs to me that the context he's dealing with here is not women in general, it's women or wives praying and prophesying, which would be the two moments that they would be communing with God. I mean, women speaking to God in prayer, or women who walk with the prophet, listening to God as he communicated with them. So it's that moment when she is sort of in the presence of God.
I think that's a very good point to make, because again, remember, this hierarchy is universal. And particularly in the context of worshiping, Paul is essentially making the point that you don't throw out the hierarchy while you're worshiping God. In fact, if anything, this is a time where it means more because this came from God. And it really is setting that example, both within the church in Corinth, but also for the angels. Because when we look in the book of Jude, it talks about angels that did not keep their domain. Essentially, they threw away the hierarchy. And so, to me, that seems to be the context that Paul is talking about. One final thing. I grew up in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s. Philip and Judy can tell you all that for a time period there, that seemed to be the only topic that mattered for a lot of preachers, is how long were men wearing their hair. And it was almost like they showed up at the church building with a set of razors, start cutting young boys' hair that was getting too long. That is not the primary point that Paul's talking about. In fact, it is actually the illustration that Paul is using to make his primary point. He's saying, don't you understand? Nature is telling us something. Nature is telling us it's a shame for a man to have long hair, or it's a shame for a woman to shave her head. That's just his illustration. So don't let this get all caught up in an argument about how long a man's hair can be before it gets too long, or how short a woman's hair gets before it's too short or shaven. On the other hand, Paul's illustration is based on something. And so I don't think we need to go the opposite extreme and say, well, that was just an illustration, doesn't mean anything. It does mean something. It's an illustration that Paul used. And so I'll just leave it at that there is a natural illustration that Paul is using here, and it's to make the valid point to talk about the hierarchy. Anybody got any questions or comments about what we've covered tonight? All right, next week, please pick up at verse 17. And it's a subject that we often talk about. We should. Coming together to partake in the Lord's Supper. It is my conviction from not only this passage, but also Acts chapter 20, that it was the purpose that first century churches gathered together on the first day of the week. And I believe it should be our purpose for gathering together today. It's not just something that we do while we're here. It's not something we do just so that, we do that while we've heard the preacher preach a sermon. It is in fact the reason why we gather together, because it is a very, very sacred meal. And that's the point that Paul is going to make to the Corinthians. It had lost its sanctity in the church there in Corinth, and he wants to bring them back to that. Thank you.